and everything else.
Yeah, right.
I'm ready to be told, time for secrets to unfold. It's our time to come of age, time to page. Don't wanna be inside the dark, live within a question mark. Will be a friend or foe? Tell me now. We need to know. Need to know. Need to
Now, let's welcome this week's host of Epic Voyages, Leena Peltoniemi, on Inception Radio Network.
Good evening, Epic radio listeners. This is Leena Peltoniemi in Houston. And I am just so excited to welcome you to Epic Radio and to introduce our guest this evening, John Anthony West, Egyptologist, a real true scholar, author of such wonderful books as The Traveler's Key to Ancient Egypt, which I used a lot, Serpent in the Sky, and he is also the 1993 Emmy Award-winning documentary author, The Mystery of the Sphinx. Oh, boy. And the narrator for that was Charlton Heston. John Anthony West has been called radical. He's been called a rogue. But as you will hear this evening, he is perhaps the foremost authority, at least that I know of, on the symbolist theory of Egyptology. That's one of the subjects that we'll be talking about. We'll talk about the Sphinx and all kinds of wonderful things. So, good evening, John Anthony West, and welcome.
Thank you, Lena. And it is nice to reestablish a connection. It's been a while.
It has. So John, why don't you tell us, explain about the symbolist theory of Egyptology, and what does it actually mean? What is its importance to us today?
Okay, that's a good question, because it can be made to sound as if it's just dry scholarship and a quibble between academics that nobody outside of academia could give a damn about. But actually it's much more than that, as should be evident to practically anybody who's with warm blood in them, that at the moment we are going through a major shift in everything that we were brought up to think was business as usual or anything as usual. I mean, let's face it, times are always changing. They're just that in the very distant past, it doesn't look as though they were changing as quickly as they are now. And maybe they weren't. I mean, Egypt holds together quite recognizable for 3,000 years. But to the people living in Egypt, it probably did look as though it wasn't the same as in their grandfather's day and their great-grandfather's day and things of that nature. But right now, I think it's safe to say it's changing faster than at any time that we have any historical, any record of anything changing the way that things are changing now. And what's pretty obvious to virtually everyone is that it's catastrophic. I mean, what's going on now is the demise of a materialistic civilization that has been, if you kind of call it civilization. I don't actually. I call it. It's a religious organization called the Church of Progress, and it is the antithesis of a civilization. It's materialistic, rationalistic, based upon the premise. Actually, if you dig real deep down, they never say it in so many words, but it's based upon the premise that life is essentially meaningless. We're born, we live, we die, and that's the end of it. And anybody who thinks otherwise, who thinks that there's some purpose in it, is deluded, superstitious, all kinds of negative and pejorative terms applied to anybody who doesn't buy into the reigning paradigm. And what is happening now, I mean, it's much more obvious that it's happening on an economic and financial and societal level, that the whole thing is breaking apart. But the societal level itself is a consequence of that philosophy. People don't think that way. And I mean, I do a lot of work these days, especially with a good friend of mine, my colleague Gerald Salente, the trends analyst, who's basically, we've been, the two of us, but especially Gerald, has been right about what's going on right now for many, many years, decades even, and we've been writing about it together in a couple of books and in an organ called the Trends Journal. And most of what's been going on doesn't, I mean, we connect to the philosophical side obliquely, not overtly. But Egypt is the antithesis to what's going on now. It's actually a real civilization in the true sense of the word, in which human life, we individually and collectively are here for a purpose. And that purpose, very easy to express in just a few words, very difficult actually to put into practice. But that purpose is the quest for immortality. All of Egypt, 3,000 years of it, was based upon a single issue, which to us is almost unimaginable, and that is the immortality of the soul, which is a process. It's not airy-fairy. It's the result of a whole lifetime, and many lifetimes perhaps, of inner work. And symbolist Egypt is the extraordinary doctrine developed by the incredible French scholar with the unpronounceable name, R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, who put together, over the course of many years, 2 decades of scholarship, he reformulated the wisdom of the ancients, which actually had never 100% died. It's very unfashionable, but up until the beginnings of the Church of Progress, which is mid-18th century, and the so-called Age of Enlightenment, when suddenly civilization became rationalist, materialistic, eventually Darwinian, and scientific. What calls itself scientific, actually, it's superstition in its own right. But up until that time, it was understood in most circles, in most scholarly circles, or it was believed, let's say, because it wasn't the kind of scholarship that we have today, but it was believed that ancient Egypt was the fount of all of the ancient wisdom, and so it was and is. But nobody had really put it together, because a lot of it was locked in the then impenetrable hieroglyphs, and you couldn't visit Egypt. I mean, you couldn't, with the conflict between the Islamic world and the Christian world, up until the 19th century, actually, visiting Egypt was not just difficult, which of course it was, but it was dangerous. So, and there wasn't much scholarship in the sense that we have it there now, we have it today. So, in fact, the ancient wisdom trickled down over the course of centuries. It was recognized as such. As I said, Kepler, when he discovered the laws of planetary motion, exulted that he had rediscovered the wisdom of the ancients. Well, in other words, why would he say something like that instead of just discovered something brand new? Because that reputation of Egypt had percolated down through the centuries. It was understood, or it was believed as a matter of fact, even though it wasn't yet a matter of fact, that it was believed that it was seen, or it was recognized as the source of all wisdom by the great scholars of the Italian Renaissance, who were busy trying to reconstruct the wisdom of the ancients. And anyway, Schwaller's immense contribution to scholarship, as it were, or to civilization, you might say, was to reformulate, after 20 years of work on the site, to reformulate that ancient wisdom in a context that was accessible to the, let's say, the rationally overweighted modern mind. In Scholar is not an easy read, but he put it in a way that you could understand. I mean, the documentation, the scholarship is impeccable, and there's no mistaking that Scholar is correct about this interpretation. And now this is where we get back to what I was talking about earlier, that it's not a quibble among academics. You see, academic Egyptology takes as a given, this is the central credo of the Church of Progress, that we, in our 21st century, with our weapons of mass destruction and our depleted uranium weapons and our bobblehead dolls and our Walmarts and Disneylands, are the highest and most civilized human beings have ever existed on the face of this planet. Well, Egypt is a living proof that it isn't. As you know, you were in Egypt with me, and once you visited the temples of Luxor and the pyramids and been into some of those tombs, after a couple of weeks in Egypt, you understand the difference between what we call progress and they call civilization. So Schwaller put together this doctrine and demonstrated exactly the contrary. I mean, in no other field of scholarship that I know of is the disparity between, let's say, opposing point of views as dramatic as it is in Egypt. I mean, in the Church of Progress Egyptological standard explanation, which is all you'd get in any school or university, Egypt is a kind of magnificent dry run for real civilization, which begins with the Greeks and the Romans, even though the Greeks themselves acknowledged that Egypt was the source of their own wisdom. But because the dogma is, in Church of Progress dogma is, that we're the most advanced that ever was, it follows, let's say logically, that the further back you go, the more primitive it gets. So it's inadmissible for Egypt to have been a far higher and more sophisticated civilization than anything in Greece and Rome, though when you go there and visit it, you can't miss it. Actually, a line I always use in my talks, and I'll use it now, that Egypt is like sex. People always say, well, why is Egypt like sex? Well, it's because you can read all about it, and you can even look at interesting pictures, but until you've experienced it, you actually don't understand anything about it. Nothing, really. I mean, you might know a lot, but you haven't experienced it. And it's only when we visit Egypt that you get that experience, and once you have that experience, then you know. You can't miss it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So that's basically the, in a nutshell. It's a very long nutshell, but in a nutshell.
But
yeah, go ahead, Leena.
John, when we were there, the one thing that sticks in my mind so strongly still, that everything that you taught us and showed us, it seemed that the ancients, they deliberately built these complex, mathematically coded messages embedded in these structures, into these buildings, into everything. And today, in 2011, we can barely build a functional house that won't crumble when there's a little bit of a huff and a puff.
Well,
and we are...
Yeah.
It just boggles the mind that people don't understand how much importance Egypt holds.
Oh, yeah, well, it does, but it's, again, see, we can fly to the moon, which they couldn't do and probably wouldn't have wanted to do, but it's not important to us to build a great cathedral or a great temple, so we build bobblehead dolls and Disneyland, who were important to us if our values were exactly the opposite of what they are now and what they were back then we could, if we knew enough. Actually, we don't even know enough, because we have to reacquire a lot of the knowledge that they had back then. But through people like Schwaller and a number of other great scholars and great spiritual leaders of the last century, or actually of all centuries, but in the last century as well, the let's say the theoretical capacity is there to reacquire the knowledge of the ancients and reformulate our own society in a way, let's say in a conformable way to, in other words, let's see, how do I express it? That the values that produce those wonderful temples and tombs and pyramids that we experienced on my trips, that knowledge, in other words, a completely different philosophy of life is required in order to produce that kind of work. But in the production of that kind of work lies the possibility of reacquiring a meaning to our own lives. So this is why, again, I repeat, and I will repeat it ad nauseum if I have to, that this is why it's not a quibble among scholars, because we're now living at the cusp of the breakdown of an entire phony and horrible and violent civilization. But what's going to replace it? Well, it could be replaced by sheer fascism. America is getting more and more fascistic by the day. They've just gone and assassinated some guy that they didn't, who's an American citizen, who wasn't even charged with anything. They just decided that he was dangerous, and they blew him off the face of the earth. This is unconstitutional, and to begin with, but who cares? But we're living in the midst of absolute crazy chaos, and more of the same isn't going to get us out of there. For example, materialistic scientists, and if you read the New York Times or any of the Financial Times or any of the Scientific American, the belief, as superstitious as the tooth fairy, but the belief is that more technology will get us out of the same pickle that all this technology up to now has got us into. This is nonsense. The only thing that will get us out of it, if anything is going to get us out of it, is the reestablishment of a civilization based upon the eternal principles that fueled Egypt. So, this is no longer a quibble between academics. This is a matter literally of, quite literally, of life and death. And for any civilization to take root, real civilization in the Egyptian sense, it has to be based upon those principles. And all of the ancient civilizations, all the great civilizations of the past, including civilizations that we don't even think of as civilization. We think they're primitive or traditional or whatever language we want to use for them. But they're the same thing. In other words, they're based upon the same understanding. It just happens not to be intellectualized, and it isn't expressed even in the kind of philosophy that Egypt is expressed as. Egypt expresses, once you understand what's going on there, Egypt expresses cosmology through myth and symbol. We express a very similar cosmology, at least at the higher ends of the upper reaches of science, where it merges into a genuine mysticism. But we express it in mathematics, which is only accessible to mathematicians, whereas in Egypt and all of the ancient civilizations of China, of India, probably of Mesoamerica, expressed that scientific understanding, Schwaller called it a sacred science, in myth and symbol, which is instantly recognizable. It resonates inside us, as it were. So without even having to intellectualize it, we respond to it. And that's a peculiar thing, because a lot of the ancient myths and symbols live forever, and you don't even know that that's what you're watching, for example, or what you're experiencing, when the Isis-Osiris-Horus myth, which is central to Egypt and which becomes Christianity, and we were there in Egypt, so you could watch it in front of your eyes. You could watch ancient Egypt transforming into the basis of the Christian doctrine. But that Isis-Osiris-Horus myth surfaces much later, or let's say it doesn't surface much later. It's prevalent all over the world. Wonderful book called Hamlet's Mill by two historians of science, Georgios Santillana and his colleague Esteban Deckhand, written in the late 60s, Hamlet's Mill, which traces this particular myth, which is the Isis-Osiris-Horus myth, throughout the world. It surfaces in all of these different civilizations, and in particular it comes out in Denmark, where it's called The Mill of Omladi, which gets taken up by Shakespeare, and it becomes a pretty well-known play called Hamlet. Well, that then surfaces, and the critics mostly missed it, a few got it, in a very interesting Walt Disney cartoon film back in the 90s, I think, called The Lion King. And that was a huge success, and I understand it was a terrible play, but it was an enormously successful play. It was a quite magical animated film, and whoever wrote that, whoever was the screenwriter of that film, knew their Egypt, because, did you see it, Leena?
Yes,
Did you see The
yes.
Lion King? You saw the animated cartoon?
Right.
Yeah. Well, you remember, there's a scene in there where the lion cub, the little lion cub, is looking up at the stars, and he says to his father, the Lion King, what are those? And the father says, oh, those are the souls of dead kings. Well, that means that whoever wrote, that's not part of Hamlet. That's not in the Hamlet myth or the Hamlet story. But that's part of Egypt, where in the pyramid texts themselves, there's a wonderful line that talks about the dead king, and it says, let me see if I remember it exactly. The king, yes, in death, the soul of the king becomes a star and joins the company of Ra, which is the sun or the solar principle, and sails with him across the sky in his boat of millions of years. So whoever wrote The Lion King knew, because you wouldn't know anywhere else, you're certainly not going to find it in the Scientific American, that the stars are the souls of dead kings. Now, whether that's meant literally or whether that's meant symbolically, we can't say, and we don't have enough time in our hour and a half to get into a long, complicated discussion about that. But these are the ancient tales which are, myth is now used as a symbol. You look it up as a synonym. You look it up in the dictionary, and it means a lie. And actually, this is a terrible mistake, because the ancient myths are not lies. They are actually science, but cosmological science, astronomical science, but told, but let's say communicated as stories. They're dramatized. So they're not told as mathematics. They have a plenty advanced mathematics too, but that's another matter altogether. You mentioned it before as the basis of the temples is geometrical and harmonic. But the myths themselves are actually they're science stories, not so much disguised, but communicated as tales that you can tell to your children. And even though they won't understand the science, the emotional power of the story will communicate itself, as it does in, the Isis-Osiris-Horus myth, as it is told, because it pertains to Egypt. It doesn't really resonate emotionally with us, but Hamlet, in a good production, does resonate. And The Lion King, even though it was a Disney cartoon, had a lot of emotional power to it. So these old stories can still communicate. Anyway,
John, it's so true. It's throughout all the civilizations. I think personally in Finland,
sure.
the old ancient shaman stories of Lapland, they have the same. It resonates the same way, and the story is exactly the same.
Right. Yeah, I bet it. Yeah, sure it would. It would. Finland is one of those countries where you probably have not lost, even though it's a very advanced and modernized society. It still hasn't. Correct me, because I haven't had a girlfriend, as you know, wonderful Finnish girlfriend long ago, but I never did get to Finland. But my understanding of it is that the Finns still have their anchors down. They still have their roots in the past in a way that, for the most part, we in America have practically entirely lost sight of it. Not the Native Americans, but all of us gringos and melting pot Americans who got here and are all mixed up genetically and so forth and so on. We don't have any direct connection, anyway, not a visceral connection with those ancient times, but I bet you still do in Finland.
Yeah, we do, very much into the nature and the connection to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things I wanted to ask you about Egypt is that you always said that it is so much older. And one thing I remember you talking about, that such complex civilization could not possibly just sort of pop up and spring into full being without long period of development or evolution, that's a fallacy. It didn't actually need the long period of development as we understand it. Am I correct on that?
Well, yes and no. We don't know. See, the actually one of the aspects of my own work. I mean, it's mostly what I do. I bill myself, self-described as Schwaller de Lubitsch's Boswell. I mean, Schwaller is unfortunately quite impenetrable as a writer, and I'm a writer by trade. So, in my book, In Serpent in the Sky, I managed to make, I think I do a pretty good job of it, of making his symbolist interpretation accessible to intelligent modern readers, and whereas Schwaller himself is kind of a nightmare. It's really not easy. People come on my trips who have doctorates in aeronautical engineering and all kinds of very advanced subjects, and they can't have trouble with Schwaller, largely because it's a way of thinking. It's not just intellectual power, but it's a way of thinking that's so alien to us. But anyway, Schwaller, the Egyptians themselves, in certain texts, express their conviction or their knowledge that their own civilization goes back much further than the 3000 BC, 3500 BC date that is assigned to it by academics. And of course, this is anathema to the Church of Progress, because it's bad enough that you have this fabulous civilization of Egypt at a time when, I mean, way before the Greeks, when there's not supposed to be any civilization at all, and then to posit that it in and of itself dates from something much earlier is of course even more heretical than symbolist Egypt to begin with. But Schwaller, in one of his last books before he died in 61 or 62, a book called The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy. All of these works now by Schwaller, actually written in French, are now translated into English, and in fact translated very well. When I was doing my book, Serpent, actually I pretty much had to learn French in order to write my own book. I had sort of rudimentary French, but spent a year in the library fighting my way through Schwaller's enormous volumes. Anyhow, there was a long chapter in this book, The King of the Pharaonic Theocracy, where he documents, or he writes about this ancient Egyptian belief that they came from a much earlier, that their civilization was much older. And he puts together a whole bunch of, let's say, of scholarly sources from the Greeks and the Romans around the time of Jesus, who were in Egypt and conversing with the Egyptian priests and recording what they were telling them about their own history. And so there's a lot of this, but it's all a scholarly argument, so you can't prove it's science. It's not worth anything. It's interesting, but because they all agree with each other, but of course that's their story, so why shouldn't they agree with each other? And then Schwaller comes out with this one bombshell, because actually, I should go backtrack a little bit. The Egyptians talk about, in certain of their documents, there's a tablet called the Palermo Stone, which is in a museum in Palermo, and there's another papyrus called the Turin Papyrus, which is in a museum in Torino, in Turin, in Italy. And on these documents, the Egyptians themselves talk about long periods of time, thousands and thousands of years, when Egypt was ruled by the Necheru, that is, the gods themselves, and then another long period when they were ruled by the Shemsuhor, which means the companions or the followers of Horus. And of course, the academics, who I call the quackademics, dismiss this out of hand. But Schaller was talking about this, and he's taking it seriously. I mean, the quackademics have no problem in saying flat out that their scholarly opinions, that they know more about ancient Egyptian history than the ancient Egyptians did, which is a peculiar kind of quackademic arrogance that actually prevails over most disciplines that are devoted to the past. Anyhow, Schroller wrote this long chapter, and then at the very end of it, and he said, of course, the Great Sphinx of Giza displays unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion, water erosion. That's an exact translation of what he said. And when I read that, I mean, the penny dropped in the slot, and I said, well, the rest of this chapter is very interesting, the scholarship, but it's not science. But water weathering should be science. So if you could prove that the Great Sphinx of Giza was weathered by water and not by wind and sand, which was the general assumption, since it's in the middle of the desert, that if you could prove that, which is a geological question, you would be able to demonstrate that the ancient Egyptians knew what they were talking about and that their civilization was many, many thousands of years older. So that then sent me back to the library for another 6 months or so, reading whatever I could find about Egyptian geology. And I'm not a geologist, but nevertheless I can read. So the last chapter of Serpent in the Sky, and that's published in 78, I guess, 78 or 79, the last chapter is devoted to my own inquiry into this question of the water weathering of the Sphinx. And from everything that I could read and geologists that I consulted, it seemed to be a very plausible, in fact, it seemed to be a pretty much incontrovertible hypothesis. The kind of weathering that you see on the Sphinx is the result of water and not of wind and sand, and this was pretty straightforward, I thought. Anyway.
Well,
yeah.
I think, John, that when you did your special with Dr. Robert Schock,
yes,